For me, I think racial discrimination and harassment are the ones that kind of resonate the most. I remember when I was first a law graduate, lots of what we'd call now microaggressions from colleagues. And I distinctly remember it was about 20 of us graduates sitting in quite a small space together. So, we were in each other's space all the time. And for some reason, they were talking about us being a family. And then they said, "Oh, but Lisa, you're the help." I just thought, wow, I was the only Pacific person in that cohort of graduates. And yeah, it really affected me, knowing that my peers viewed me that way, but also the fact that, the supervisor never intervened. She never said anything. And I actually did raise it as an issue with the partners of the firm in a letter, and they just never responded. At the time, there was talk about sexual harassment. There was quite a lot of talk about it. This was 10 years ago. And then more recently, there's been all the talk, the Meto movement, and particularly sexual harassment around certain big firms. And I felt that as a young Pacific woman, racial harassment was actually far more of an issue for me than sexual harassment. I have experienced sexual harassment, but for me, the racial harassment was far greater an issue. And I've always kind of thought that, when's that issue going to come to the fore? When are we going to talk about racial harassment? I think there's a growing awareness of racism generally. Obviously there was the Black Lives Matter movement last year. There's long been treaty rights and movements around rights of tangata whenua, but there is still that hesitance around, I don't want to be seen to be raising the race card. I think it's about, number one, recognising it for what it is, and number two, supporting each other to have those conversations. And then number three, I think it's about employers being willing to listen and being willing to hear that your staff member might feel minoritised or racially harassed or culturally unsafe. We do hear that Pacific people are humble, and we hear that both from non-Pacific people and Pacific people themselves. But I would actually challenge that, because the other thing that we're hearing through the inquiry is that when Pacific workers do get the confidence to challenge equal pay issues, such as where they are being paid less than a colleague with exactly the same qualification and experience, when they raise that issue with their manager, they're told to mind their own business, to lump it or leave it. Why is that person being paid $5,000 less than their colleague with exactly the same skills and experience in the first place? That's actually on the employer, It's actually unlawful. It's already unlawful. But I think that employers need to look at themselves and challenge their biases and think about, what is it that makes them think that a Pacific person is worth less? I think it's the perfect time for us to be having this conversation. I think it's long overdue. Nobody wants to be called a racist, right? I understand that. But you do have to really challenge yourself. And I think you can start with the easy stuff like measuring ethnicity. Sometimes we meet with employers and they say, there's no ethnic pay gap here. And we say, okay, well, how do you know that? And they say, we think there isn't one, and it's clear that they haven't actually measured it. What are our values as a society? What kind of world do we want for each other and for our children? And do we want that to be one where all people, regardless of their ethnicity, can live with dignity, can have enough to provide for their children, have a decent home to live in, feel fulfilled by their jobs? Or do we want what's happening now, which is there's an increasingly a large segment of society who are the working poor, and they're struggling every day, and that's actually not good for them, and that's actually not good for all of us. We have some ideas about solutions, but we don't have all the answers, and we do need to hear from Pacific workers to make sure that what we're saying works in the real world and isn't just going to be another report or another policy document. We really do need to also hear from our MVP FAF Plus community and our disability community. We don't want this to just be about Pacific professional men or specific groups of us who might already carry some privilege. We do want to hear from groups who do have extra barriers. We're not one group, we're not all Samoan as I am or all Tongan or whatever it might be. There is a diversity amongst Pacific peoples, and so we do want to really hear from that diversity from the diverse groups within Pacific.